Welcome to Get Your Mind Right, the podcast where merchant services, digital marketing, and personal growth collide. Tune in for real talk, fresh insights, and the motivation to level up.
John Johnson, good morning and welcome to Get Your Mind Right. This is the world's only podcast devoted to merchant services and digital marketing professionals. Well, folks, I'm going to come out of the cannon here shooting hard because this is a hard reset, what we're doing today. I'll be very direct with you. I think most of us believe we're prospecting anytime we're on the phone. It could be any kind of form, whether you're cold calling, whether you're talking to a lead or a possible prospect. But the truth of the matter here is often what we're doing is just dialing. We're talking, we're booking meetings. You know what? That's not really prospecting. Prospecting is qualification, and qualification is about truth. And truth, well, it's measurable. And if you can't measure it, then you really didn't uncover it. Now, this isn't scripts. It's not about personality. It's not about confidence. It's about discipline. And most pipelines aren't weak because the market's hard, because competition's strong. They're weak because your standards are loose. Today, we are here to tighten that standard. Now, by the end of this session, I want the definition of a successful prospecting call to be different than what it was when you logged in. So I want to talk to you about the old way of doing things. But before we go any further, I want to tip my hat to my friend Brad Holler. Because you see, Brad introduced me to the term hopium. Now, hopium, it's a dangerous narcotic that business development folks can become a hopeless slave to. Hopium is your enemy. Let me explain what that is. So say you got a merchant on the phone. They're friendly. They don't object. They give you some time. And then the call was saying, sure, send something on over. It feels like a win. But you know what? It isn't. A win is permission to follow up. And that's very different from a prospect. So let's talk about examples. My first example I'm going to give you, and this is a real life situation you're facing every day, and I call it polite fiction. So you're a rep and you're calling someone up. Are you happy with your processor? Merchant says, yeah, it's fine. Rep says, if I could save you some money, would you take a look? Merchant says, sure, send me something over. Great, what's your email? So that meeting gets scheduled, proposal gets sent, and it feels productive. But let's slow that down. So in that little dialogue there, what problem was acknowledged? None. What cost was admitted? None. What urgency existed? Once again, none. This is not a prospect. That is a polite conversation. And polite conversations, they don't result in deals. They drift away. Well, let's keep it going and let's go into another example that I call false momentum. This starts out with you saying, hey, would you be open to reviewing your rates? Merchant says, well, sure, we can take a look. You say, great, let's meet next Thursday. Merchant says, okay. Oh, you're feeling good. Calendar's booked, max updated, pipeline grows. But what actually changed here? Absolutely nothing changed. There was no new awareness. There was no new urgency, no new consequence. And meetings without consequence are nothing more than social appointments. They're not sales opportunities. Now, if I opened up your pipeline right now and removed every deal that didn't have a real acknowledged problem, a lot of your so-called pipeline would disappear. Now, hey, this is not a personal attack. This is a standard. If you want to get off the hopium, it begins right here, right now. Now, what I'm telling you is the way you think about traditional prospecting, it really protects your ego. Because what you're doing is you are creating motion and you are creating activity and you're filling calendars. But it doesn't create any leverage. And without leverage, most of these deals never survive. Now, let's look at the same situation handled differently. Let me see. I'm going to think of a name for this. We're going to call it a good call. Instead of saying, are you happy with your processor? You say, hey, quick question. Are you currently absorbing your processing fees or are your customers paying them? Merchant says, well, we absorb them. Roughly what does that run you monthly? Well, about $4,500. Okay, so let me make sure I understand this. If nothing changes this year, it's about $54,000. Is this something you've actively tried to address? Now, my question is what changed? Because your difference is measurable, it's because the problem became visible and the cost became concrete. 3 big changes there. Now your merchant is thinking in terms of consequence, not curiosity. That is your shift. That's the difference between collecting data and diagnosing problems. And that's where leverage begins. Now, there's one more practical piece that we need to address here before we qualify the deal, and that's access. Now, if you're one of these folks that is calling cold into a place, you're using the telephone, or even if you're showing up in person, this is getting past that gatekeeper, because none of this that we're talking about matters if you don't ever reach the decision maker. Now, the first thing I want you to do is shift how you think about gatekeepers, because their job, simply put, is to filter noise. And if you sound like noise, well, you've just gotten filtered. Now, on the other hand, if you sound like relevance, you're going to get routed. Most reps I see make one of 2 mistakes. A, they either try to overpower the gatekeeper, or B, they try to trick them. Now, these 2 things have something in common. Neither work long term. High performers do something much simpler. They sound like they belong. They're calm. They're direct. They're specific. Not saying things like, hey, I'm calling to see if the owner is available. Because to me, that sounds like a pitch is coming. Instead, I'm going to say, hi, is Bob available? That gatekeeper asks, what's this regarding? Yes, it's regarding how Bob is currently handling card processing fees. Now, you'll notice what you didn't hear here. You didn't hear a full explanation or a pitch, only context. Your gatekeepers, they're listening for confidence and clarity. And when you find yourself hesitating, overselling, over-explaining, you signal that you're interrupting. If you're concise and grounded, you signal that you're relevant. Now, let's be realistic here. Sometimes they are still going to block you. And you know what? That's fine. Then your objective, well, it's going to shift. Not to force access, but to gather intelligence. Ask questions like, who typically oversees that area? When's the best time to reach Bob? Is email better for initial contact? Your access here, it's not emotional, it's strategic. And here's your discipline piece. If you cannot confidently state why you're calling in one sentence, you are never going to get past a gatekeeper. Relevance earns routing, noise gets filtered. Now, I want to give you a couple of practical talk tracks that you might be able to use. And my first scenario is a direct transfer. Gatekeeper's going to say, what's this regarding? Well, it's regarding how Bob is currently handling processing costs. It'll only take a moment. I'm calm, and then I'm going to be silent. I'm going to give that gatekeeper room and space to answer me. And my next thing I'm going to run into is what I call a soft block. Gatekeeper says, hey, they're not available. Can I take a message? Well, sure. When is typically the best time to catch Bob live? If they push for more detail, I'm going to say something like, I'm just trying to confirm whether this is worth reviewing on his processing structure. I don't want to take time unless it makes sense. Now, you notice what I'm doing here. No selling, positioning only. My next scenario is a hard block. Your gatekeeper comes back tough. We don't take these kind of calls. Understood. Quick question. Does someone internally review your processing costs periodically? Now what I've done is shifted from access to intelligence. Now, these gatekeepers, they don't require aggression. They require presence from you. You need to sound like you belong. You need to be clear and not be desperate. And move on emotionally if you get terminally blocked here. Access is a skill. It is not a confrontation. I need to be very clear about something before we go any further. Nothing that you are hearing today means that activity does not matter. Quite the opposite, actually. Activity is your ticket to the game. If you're not shaking trees, nothing is ever going to fall out. If you're not dialing, you are never going to get a chance to diagnose. If you're not creating conversations, you're not going to surface problems. No such thing as high-level qualification without some sort of volume. Meaningful activity is non-negotiable. Now, the issue here is not activity. The issue is confusing activity with progress. Dials matter. Conversations matter. Call blocks matter. Volume matters. Volume with qualification discipline produces you pipeline. You do not get to skip activity and jump straight to leverage. You earn leverage through activity. Now, if you want real problems, you must create real conversations. If you want real conversations, you've got to make real dials. Activity is your engine, and without that engine, you are going to go nowhere. We are not reducing activity. We are upgrading to what happens inside it. So let's replace the definition. Now that we're getting rid of the old standard, let's define the new standard. Because once you see this flaw in the old model, I dare you to unsee it, because you can't. Now, under our new standard, a prospect exists only when three things are true. Not when it feels promising, not when it feels good, not when you've booked your meeting. Three things. First, that merchant acknowledges a specific problem, a real problem, and it has to be their problem, not your problem. If you're the one explaining why something is a problem, then they don't have a problem yet. What you have is a pitch, and that's something very, very different. Now, second, that problem that we're talking about, it has to matter enough to act. Not someday, not after the busy season, not, hey, circle back with me after second quarter. It's got to matter right now. And you can tell it matters because something shifts here. Their tone shifts, their thinking shifts, their language shifts. If nothing shifts, then the problem doesn't matter. And if the problem doesn't matter, your deal's not going to move. Now, the third thing is that doing nothing has a cost. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means by doing nothing or waiting, it's going to cause pain. Delaying costs your merchant something. Inaction, contrary to popular belief, is not neutral. Inaction is a cognizant decision. Because if nothing negative happens while someone is waiting, then that waiting they're doing is perfectly rational. Think about your own experience for a minute. Now, how many of you have presented a dual pricing solution where you've saved the merchant, say, $1,000 a month? You end the call, you're feeling great. Merchant says they want to think about it and promises to follow up. Well, they don't. A few days pass and you follow up. They tell you they need some more time. A few weeks pass, you follow up again. They're still thinking. 3 months later, you are stuck in an infinite check-back follow-up loop. You reiterate the benefits. They respond, yeah, I know. It's just not a priority. So frustrating. Yet, here you are. And here's the issue. On the first call, you believed the merchant saw strong value. You believed there was urgency. After all, doesn't everyone want an extra $1,000 a month in their pocket? But urgency is not determined by interest. It is determined by consequence. So ask yourself, during the 3 months that your prospect waited, what negative outcome did they experience? Did the profits of their business collapse? Did they lose customers? Did anything materially worsen? Did your merchant, did they die because they did not accept your proposal? The answer in most cases, almost all the time, is a big fat no, which means waiting was the right thing and the rational thing for them. If nothing breaks, nothing changes. Now, your proposal here, it was beneficial, but it wasn't urgent. And this is proven by the fact that they waited and survived. Waiting is always the correct move for a merchant unless a true problem exists or a change agent is introduced. Value alone does not close deals. Consequence does. So before we move on, let's review the 3 items that must be present for a prospect to act. Number 1, that merchant acknowledges a specific problem. Number 2, the problem matters enough to act. And 3, doing nothing has a cost. If even one of these 3 elements is missing, this is where your pipeline collapses. You may think you're a bad closer. Your manager may think you cannot close. People you work with will tell you you cannot close. Well, my friends, my experience is your problem is not closing. Your problem is proper qualification. Because most reps, what they do is qualify optimism, their own optimism. This is hopium's most deadly side effect. Interest feels good. Interest doesn't mean a whole lot. Meetings always feel productive. But meetings, they don't mean anything without leverage. Now, some of you are thinking, hey, Johnson, You understand, deals take time. You know what? You're right, they do. But time, it's not the issue here. Consequence is your issue, and consequence is the absolute antidote to hopium. Now, if time passes and nothing gets worse, you're not in a sales cycle, you're now in a conversation cycle. These are two very different things. Some of you are thinking here, okay, well, you know what? At the time, they seem serious. Well, what your problem is you cannot measure serious. If you cannot, once again, state the problem clearly in one sentence, then it's not defined enough. If you can't explain why it matters now, it doesn't matter. If you can't describe what happens if they do nothing, then you haven't gained any leverage. This definition is not flexible. It's binary. It's on, it's off, it's black, or it's white. All three of these things have to exist, or your deal, it's not going to move forward. Now, you may be thinking about this. Oh my gosh, this is going to shrink my pipeline. You know what? Good. A smaller pipeline built on truth will outperform a larger pipeline built on hope every single time. From this point forward, the objective of these calls is not solely just to book a meeting. It is to surface a real problem or disqualify it cleanly. If you hang up a prospecting call and you cannot clearly state what the problem is now, why it matters, and what happens if nothing changes, then what kind of call did you have? Well, you just postponed reality. And hope, my friends, it is not a strategy. Truth is a strategy. Now, I've got some folks that are regular listeners to the show, and they're lead generators. So if you're a lead generator, this is for you. If your job is to open doors and pass qualified conversations to a rep, you've got a new win. And your win is that you surface a measurable issue, and the merchant agrees that it deserves deeper discussion. That's your win. Here's what it sounds like. I'm going to say, roughly what does that cost you monthly? Well, about $4,000. Okay, so that's close to $50,000 a year. Have you actively looked at reducing that? No, not really. Well, based on that number alone, it sounds like it's worth a deeper look. Would it make sense to bring in one of our specialists to break down options for you? Merchant's going to say, yeah, that does make sense. Now that right there, that's a win. It's not curiosity. It's not send me something. It's a measurable issue that's acknowledged, and the merchant agreed that it deserved advancement. Now, if you have the authority to diagnose and advance on the spot, your win can go even further because you've already surfaced a measurable issue here. And next, you identify structural friction. So let me make sure I understand this. If that continues unchanged, it's about $70,000 this year. In the past, what's prevented you from addressing this? Well, honestly, we've just been focused elsewhere. Well, is it because it hasn't felt big enough to prioritize, or because something internally makes this sort of change difficult? Well, you know what? It's mostly attention. So if this continues for another year, does that $70,000 matter? Well, says the merchant, it probably should. I'm going to say, let's do this properly. Let's set 20 minutes to map this out and see if this is worth fixing. Now, that's a win. It's not just a meeting anymore. Because if you cannot clearly state the measurable issue and why the merchant agreed it deserves the next step, then it doesn't qualify for a win. Now, I want to talk about an uncomfortable subject here, because this is one that a lot of sales teams actively avoid. And this is why deals stall. I want to be clear too. Don't take anything personal. We're all friends. This isn't about finger pointing or about blame. It's about structure. Because when deals stall, we tend to look outwardly. We look at price. We look at competition. We look at timing. And you know what? Sometimes those are factors. But most of the time, that stall happened much, much earlier. And that stall came from sequence. And more specifically, premature pressure. And what I find is reps escalate before they have earned permission. They introduce consequence before they've established credibility. They ask weight-bearing questions before the merchant believes that we understand their world. These are questions. Let me give you some examples, like, why does this matter now? What happens if nothing changes? Who else needs to be involved? Now, to be sure, these are strong questions. They're necessary questions. But they only work when that foundation is there. These questions come too early. They don't feel strategic. They feel forced. And when something feels forced, people tend to protect themselves. They don't argue. They contract. They shrink. They get smaller. Their answers get shorter. They're more general. They're less specific. You start hearing things like, well, we're just looking. It's not urgent. Email me something. Let's reconnect a quarter from now. And what we do is we label that as timing. But often, what we're hearing actually is contraction. And contraction is usually a signal that you just moved too fast. Most early objections are not market-driven. They're sequence-driven. When a merchant says, it's not urgent, sometimes what they mean is, I don't feel confident enough and or trust you enough in this conversation yet to expose any kind of urgency to you. When they say, email me something, what they may mean is, I'd prefer to exit this interaction politely without any kind of pressure. Now, this isn't necessarily resistance. It's protection. And if you're honest with yourself, most of the time you've triggered it. Now, this is where it gets uncomfortable and useful at the same time. When your deal that you've opened stalls 2 weeks later, we create a story. Well, they went cold on me. And when the proposal doesn't get signed, they're shopping. And when follow-ups don't move, they're price sensitive. And these explanations, they all feel reasonable. Usually what they are is their late-stage interpretations of early-stage sequencing issues. Now, what actually happened most of the time is this. We escalated the dialogue before earning the right to do so. We tried to create urgency before establishing relevance. And we introduced tension without enough structure underneath it. Sequence matters. If credibility isn't first established, your consequence will not hold. Let me give you an example of this. Rep says, are you open to reviewing your processing fees? Well, sure. If you're overpaying, it could be costing you thousands. What would that mean for your business? Well, there's a pregnant pause. The merchant comes back with, I don't know. I guess it's really not that big of an issue. Well, here's what just happened. The rep introduced consequence. He said, costing you thousands before establishing credibility. And the merchant has not agreed that there's a problem. They haven't seen any evidence. They haven't owned anything yet. So your consequence, it's not going to hold. Let's rewind this and see what happens. Rep says, well, if nothing changes, that could add up over time. What happens if you keep paying that? Merchant says, it's fine. We're doing okay. Now what happened is your specificity has collapsed. The merchant moved from numbers to generalities and from measurable to vague. So the rep, he just keeps pushing. So it wouldn't matter to reduce that? Merchant says, maybe, but let's face it, it's just not urgent. That is contraction in motion. Now, your consequence never stuck because that credibility was not first built. And because the consequence didn't hold, the specificity disappeared. No numbers, no ownership, no urgency. Your deal, it didn't die later. It fractured right here during this process. Now, you can follow it up with this. The problem was not the question. The problem was sequence. No leverage equals no deal. Most of us would interpret that as a lack of interest. But what actually happened? Well, we introduced consequence before we established relevance. Then we asked them to admit pain before they felt understood. The fracture happened right there. But in your CRM, I'm going to look at your notes, and they're going to say things like, good conversation, they're interested, follow up next week. Well, your problem is that is narrative, and narrative protects your confidence. But this narrative, it also hides the structural failure. So if you record your conversations, which, by the way, I highly recommend that you do that, and you honestly listen, and you listen closely, you can hear the moment. You can hear that moment when the specificity increases or when it drops. Because once again, these deals, most of them, they don't collapse at the end. They fracture in the first minute or two. If you don't inspect those first few minutes, you are doomed to repeat that same pattern over and over. Here's a very simple diagnostic test for you. If tension increases and specificity increases, you have earned permission to advance that dialogue. Now, on the other side of that, if tension increases and specificity decreases, that means you escalated too early. Let's reflect back on the earlier conversation and show the correct way on how to sequence and how it can fix your problem. So I might say, Mr. Client, before we talk numbers, help me understand something. Are you currently absorbing your processing fees, or are your customers incurring the fees? Well, we're absorbing them. Got it. Roughly what does that run you per month? Oh, about $6,000. Now, notice what's happened here. Have not introduced consequent yet. Just clarity, just facts. So I'm going to say, okay, well, that's about $72,000 a year. Now, have you actively ever tried to reduce that, or has that just stayed consistent? Well, it's pretty much stayed consistent. Well, now I'm cooking with gas because my merchant has acknowledged the number, which is $6,000 a month, the annual impact, which is $72,000, and the lack of action. Now the merchant has acknowledged the number, $6,000 a month, the annual impact, $72,000, and the lack of action. Just hadn't looked at it internally. They're worried about expanding the business. Now we can introduce that consequence. If this remains unchanged for another year, does that matter to you? Well, when you put it like that, it probably should. Our specificity just increased. It didn't decrease. So I'm going to say, well, what's prevented you from addressing this to date? Honestly, we just haven't prioritized it. We've been focused on that expansion. Now we have it. We've got measurable problem. We've got ownership of that problem, and we've exposed the structural constraint. Now the consequence holds because that credibility was first established. When the consequence holds, then the specificity expands. Instead of hearing, it's not a big deal, we get, yeah, that probably should matter. That is your difference. The first version, we led with consequence, and the second, we led with clarity. And that clarity, it created that credibility that we so crave. And that credibility is the foundation which withstands the weight of consequence. When this consequence holds, the specificity increases. And that's sequence. Not about personality, not about charisma. It's not about tone. It's about sequence. When that sequence is out of order, contraction happens. That's when your shrinkage takes place. And also with that contraction, information flow, well, it gets shut down. So next time you hear yourself saying, yeah, they went cold, they're shopping, they're price sensitive, let's ask a better question. Where did we escalate too early? Now, accountability here, it's not emotional, it's structure. If deals are stalling, we don't need a new script. We need to inspect the first couple of minutes of that conversation. That's usually where you're going to find your fracture lives. So everything we've talked about today, it only matters when and if behavior changes. So how do we make this operational? Well, the old prospecting way, it collects. It gets volume, it gets rates, equipment types, processors' names, contract dates. Now, collection, it feels good. It feels productive. It fills up your notes. It fills up your CRM, puts time on your calendar, but it does not create leverage. And leverage is what advances deals. Now, under this standard, diagnostic prospecting requires three things, only three. Now, first, I've got a measurable problem, not frustration, not preference, not, well, we've thought about reviewing it, but measurable. This means dollars lost, time wasted, operational drag, risk exposure. If the problem cannot be diagnosed concretely, then it's not diagnosed. Now, second, if we cannot state it clearly in one sentence, that means it's not clear enough. Next, a structural constraint. What internally is making this change difficult, if not impossible? Is it decision paths, approval layers, partner dynamics, competing priorities? If friction is invisible, this means you don't control any progression. And if you don't control that progression, then you're not going to have a deal. The last thing here is that time anchor. What is it that makes this delay expensive? Is it a renewal, some financial bleed, a deadline? Because if time floats, that urgency also floats away. And floating urgency means that your deal, once again, is not going to move. I want to be very clear about this contrast. Collection asks, what are you paying? What equipment are you using? When does your contract expire? It's very fact-based. Where diagnosis talks about the impact, it's going to ask questions like, what is that costing you? What happens if this continues? What internally makes fixing this problem difficult? Now, your collection, it gathers information, and this diagnosis, it creates leverage. Let's walk through a simple example. I'm going to say, Mr. Merchant, what are you paying in processing fees? About 2.9%. I'm collecting. Now I'm going to shift to diagnosis. What's that translate to monthly for you? Well, about $6,000. So if it stays that same way for the next year, what's that going to cost you? Well, it's going to cost me about $72,000. Now, we're not talking about percentage. We're talking about consequence. Now, what happens if that continues unchecked? The merchant says, well, it's a lot of money. That is the shift. Collection stops at data, and diagnosis moves to impact. And that's where the leverage begins. Now, I want to be crystal clear about advancement. A deal does not advance because it feels promising. It advances because those three elements are visible. If we cannot surface at least one measurable issue on a prospecting call, we didn't prospect. If we can't identify structural friction on any deal, you've lost control of it. If you can't anchor consequence to time, then you're back to operating on hope, and that hope is unstable and untenable. Now, if diagnosis does not change the direction of the calendar before the call ends, then nothing really happened here. This isn't send something or some sort of vague follow-up with some sort of vague nebulous point in the undefined future or some sort of rep-owned check-in. I'll follow up in a couple weeks. The calendar must move with consequence attached. If it doesn't, your deal isn't moving. So let's talk about consequence. If we end a call without a measurable problem and schedule a meeting anyway, we've likely created a very sad and predictable stall. Now, so from this moment on, advancement without diagnosis is not optimism. You can no longer say you didn't know. This is just indiscipline on your part. If it's not measurable, it does not move. If friction is not visible, it doesn't move. If it's not time anchored, it does not move. If that means more disqualification, hey, that is great because disqualification is data. Dragging your friction forward when you don't see it is just plain denial. We are not paid to collect conversations. We are paid to surface truth. So I want to say something that really matters here, and that's professional maturity. Because when you apply this standard correctly, things happen. Your pipeline's probably going to shrink. Your meeting count may drop. You may feel exposed and contracted for a week or two. Now, this isn't failure, and it's only natural. This is recalibration. When you stop advancing fiction, volume decreases before performance increases. That's normal. Most reps feel safer with a pipeline that is absolutely full and just stocked to the gills with fiction. Does not matter how soft or non-productive it is, because it feels like security. But false security, it creates a false reality for you. On the other hand, a tighter pipeline built on truth creates stable and predictable performance. There's a big difference between activity confidence and structural confidence. Your activity confidence says things like, I got a lot going on here. Structural confidence says, I know exactly which deals are real. Now, this first one we talked about, it feels really good. That second one, it outperforms the first one better every single time. And this may be the uncomfortable part for you. When you disqualify faster, you remove emotional cushions. All those maybes, all that hopium you're jacked up on, all that stuff disappears from your pipeline. Now, you may be left with just a few real conversations. If this feels uncomfortable at first, that is good. That is a signification of growth. It means that you're raising your standards. Because professionals, they don't protect comfort. They protect clarity. And your long-term anxiety, clarity is going to reduce that. If you do this right, you're not going to feel busy. You're going to feel precise. And precision is the winner. I want to pivot to something practical here. Because when you run that first call correctly, follow-up becomes easier. Now, a lot of reps dislike follow-up because it feels like checking in, because that's what they're doing. And they also dislike it because they don't know what to say. And you know why they don't know what to say? They don't have anything to talk about. Here's what these follow-ups look like. Just wanted to see if you had a chance to review that proposal I sent, or that email I sent, or that blah, blah, blah I sent. Just circling back, just following up. Now, this language exists because my first call didn't create leverage. And when that first call is weak, the follow-up, well, no wonder it feels awkward. It's because it is awkward. Now, when that first call is diagnostic, follow-up is a very natural and organic continuation of the first dialogue. Let me show you the difference. My week first call, merchant says, sure, send something. My follow-up 2 weeks later sounds like, hey, Bob, just want to see if you had time to look at that. My problem is there's no anchor, there's no ownership, there's no consequence. It's completely driven by me. Now, let's contrast that with a properly run first call. In our first call, we surfaced $72,000 of annual exposure, a lack of priority, and a renewal in 90 days. Now my follow-up sounds like this. Bob, last time we spoke, you mentioned that roughly $70,000 a year was flowing through unchanged, and that renewal hits in June. Now, since we're coming up on that date, I wanted to continue the conversation and see whether it makes sense to address that now. Now, this is not a check-in. That's a continuation. And it's anchored, and it's calm, and it's confident because I've got something to talk to him about. My diagnosis was strong, so in the follow-up, it wrote itself. I'm not begging for attention here. I am advancing a problem that the merchant has already acknowledged. This changes your posture, it changes your tone, and it changes your confidence. And it changes the merchant's response. Now, running these calls properly, it does not slow you down in spite of what you're feeling right now and what your senses may be telling you. What it actually does is makes the rest of the process easier and faster. Now, I want to talk about how we execute this. Because standards, these things I'm talking about, they don't live in theory. They live in call blocks. Now, if we're going to level up and we're going to raise the qualification bar, I also have to level up and raise how I show up. Because all these things we're talking about, whether it's follow-up, whether it's calling on a lead for the first time, a referral, a prospecting call, this is all production work. And when I enter one of these call blocks, I have earned the right to be undistracted. This means I have my headphones on. I've got notifications turned off on everything. I've got my phone flipped over. Even though I have my ringer turned off, I still cannot see any sort of flashing message coming across there because it's going to distract me. Also, I'm going to close out all my browser tabs. I'm going to shut my email client down. Now, this is not about intensity for the sake of intensity. It's about respecting your craft. High performers understand something that's very simple. Your energy transfers to the phone. If you're distracted, they feel it. If you're rushed, they feel it. If you're flat, you feel it. You smile when you dial. You sit up. You stand if you need to. Your posture affects your tone. And your tone, at the end of the day, is going to affect their response. This isn't motivational. This is just psychology. And it matters. Professional expectation here is simple. When it's call block time, we are fully present because precision requires your undivided 100% focus. If you're going to demand measurable problems, structural clarity, and anchored urgency, you could not be casual in how you execute. This is highly skilled work, and skilled work deserves protected time. Now, going forward, your calls, any type of call whatsoever, at some point it must produce one of two outcomes. One, you surface a measurable, acknowledged problem, and two, you disqualify cleanly. This is speed to truth, not speed to calendar. Now, I want you to take each call and inspect it. You notice I said each. This also means every call. And I want you to inspect it for a surface measurable problem or a clean, decisive disqualification. If you cannot produce one, this means very clearly you did not apply the standard. No more advancing deals on optimism. No more logging conversations as opportunities. This is truth or disqualify time. Because you know what? These are the two outcomes that matter. Because truth is doing the talking and hopium is doing the walking. Hey, I want to tell you as your humble podcaster here that I appreciate you folks listening in. And you may have noticed a lot of organic excitement in my part today. And the reason is this is really at the core of what we do. Now, I hope you're as excited about this as I am. But what's going to happen is you're going to be selfish and you're probably going to get some sleep time in tonight. And you're going to forget about some of this excitement. And you're going to forget about some of these principles. And you know what? All I did was just get a little adrenaline surge for a minute. What I'm calling for here is to adjust how you operate. And this is tough because we're talking about changing old habits and we're talking about changing behavior. But that's what being a top professional is all about, adjusting and getting better. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate getting to the opportunity to sit in front of this microphone and speak to you. And I appreciate you listening. And I'll see you back here on Friday on Get Your Mind Right Mailbag Edition. Until then, John Johnson saying so long.